Today's case involves multiple factors. There's an adopted father who had a very unusual obsession with his daughter, a baby who was uncertain of who the father was, and a strange relationship between three people, creating a complex love triangle that might have led to the disappearance and possible death of Gary Sebek. Hello and welcome to Investigating Iowa. My name is Sarah. Thank you so much for coming back this week. I am sorry that we took a little hiatus. I was trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to move forward with the cases and had a lot of stuff going on that I just had to keep up with. So thank you for coming back, and today's case is quite the whirlwind. So please bear with me as I go through all of the information laid out. Before I get started, I just want to say I mean no disrespect to any of the parties involved. I am just finding all this information through online forums, videos, articles, case files, and putting it together into a video for you to watch. So on March 4th, 1968, Gary Sebek got up for work and went to work with his coworker who drove him every single day. And it was just a normal day, and they didn't think anything out of the ordinary. But midday, Gary got a very interesting visitor at his workplace. It was his wife, Shirley, and her sister, Janice Holland. And actually, Shirley was going into labor, so they picked up Gary on their way to St. Mary's Hospital in Nebraska City. After dropping them off at the hospital, Janice, who is Shirley's sister, went back to the Sebek house. She went to go pick up Gary and Shirley's clothes so that they could stay at the hospital the next coming days with their new baby. And when she got to the house, she realized that it was quite the mess. It had dirty floors all in the kitchen, and that in the bathroom there was a stale bucket of water and a dry mop, as if somebody was about to get the area cleaned up but just never got around to it. So she went into the bedrooms and grabbed a couple pieces of clothing that she could go wash at her house and bring over for them at the hospital. During this whole process, Gary stuck by his wife's side, and pretty soon they introduced Patrick Sebek into the world, and they were so ecstatic, but they decided that Gary should go back to work the next day. And so they had a couple of their family friends drive him back to their hometown in Hamburg, Iowa, and they decided that he was going to go back to work the next day. So that was about 10:30 at night on Monday night, and they said that he went into the house and that was the last he was seen. On Tuesday, March 5th, the next day, Gary's coworker came to pick him up again, like he did every single day. And so about 5:30, his coworker drives up into the Main Street duplex that Gary and his wife lived in, and he just sat there for a while. And when Gary didn't come out, he decided to go in and just check on Gary. He noticed that all of the lights were on in the house and a radio was playing really, really loud. And so when he walked into the house, he walked into the kitchen door and noticed that Gary's cigarettes were sitting on the kitchen table. He walked past that and kind of looked around the house. He kept calling out Gary's name, but nobody answered. So he just assumed that Gary wasn't going to go to work that day and decided to leave without him. Meanwhile, Shirley was at the hospital, and she was kind of getting antsy because she didn't understand why Gary hadn't stopped by yet. He should have already been done with work, and he hadn't come by to check on her or the baby. And so she sent her sister Janice and her family friend Dina to go to the house and just check if he had maybe gone back there and crashed. So Janice and Dina go back to the Sebek house around 9:30 to 10 o'clock at night. And when they get there, they notice that all the lights are off in the house. They go in and see that the whole kitchen floor was wet, as if somebody had just mopped it. And Janice noticed that it was a lot cleaner than when she had gone and visited the day before. They also noticed that the pail of water and the wet mop were now by the basement door, which was kind of odd since they were in the bathroom before. She also noted that the light was on downstairs and that the door was open to the basement. So she assumed that maybe Gary had gone down there. So she went down there, called around for him, and he wasn't there. So they came back up. As the women started inspecting the house, they noticed some very strange things. The two big chairs in the living room had been moved back from their original positions, and you could notice that by the markings on the floor. They also noted that there was a very large pillow, a decorative pillow that normally sat on the couch, that was missing. And there was a huge blood stain on the back of the couch, kind of like where your head would rest behind you on the couch. They noticed that there was a huge stain that they thought was blood. They immediately left the house. They were very scared at this point, and they called their husbands, but they also called the police, who arrived at about 10:30 at night. The police noted everything that they had said, but they also noticed that in the breakfast area of the kitchen, there was a doll sitting in a chair, and behind that doll was splatters of possible blood. During the initial investigation, there were multiple parts of the family's history that came to light at that time. They had a bunch of events, and kind of their family dynamic was brought into the public. And so I'm going to go through that now. And just before we get started, you should know that Shirley's parents weren't her biological parents. Shirley was actually adopted with her younger brother to an older couple, named the father of which being Victor Moyer and his wife Ruth. They didn't adopt Janice, who is Shirley's sister, and I don't know exactly why. I don't know if Janice was old enough that she could not be adopted. I don't know exactly how that panned out, but they only adopted Shirley and her younger brother at the time. A lot of reports say that Victor, who also went by the name Buck, had a very unusual obsession with his daughter. He was obsessed to her past a point of just a father being concerned for his daughter. A lot of people thought that relationship was maybe a little bit more than that. But we'll get into that more as the claims come out. It was reported that Buck absolutely hated Gary. He wanted nothing to do with Gary, and he didn't want him in his daughter's life at all. And he actually went to multiple people and said that he could kill Gary with how much he hated him. Gary was terrified of his father-in-law. He was mortified by all the claims that he would make about him going missing or that he could kill him. It just got to Gary, and rightfully so. But it was also stated that Buck had a huge hand in Shirley and Gary's marriage. He would manipulate Sherry a lot of the time to make decisions that weren't necessarily her own. And these are all just statements made in different claims I found online. But it was said that there were times when Gary and Shirley would live apart because of the situation that Buck would put them through. And so Gary would go and stay at his own father's home, and he would actually sleep with all of the lights on and a gun underneath his bed because he was so terrified of Buck coming after him. On the day Patrick was born, Gary and Buck had a big confrontation at the hospital. There was known to be a lot of shouting, and that Buck came up to Gary and said that Patrick wasn't Gary's son, and that actually Patrick was Buck's son, and he had had an affair with his own adopted daughter. But none of this has been confirmed whatsoever. Again, a lot of the reports just stated that Buck controlled the young couple's lives, that he had a huge hand in everything that they did and a lot of that drama that started in their marriage. And Buck actually convinced Shirley to get a divorce from Gary, and she didn't even want to. She wanted to stay with him. She was in love with Gary, and they had decided that after Patrick was born, they were going to move to Florida, get as far away from Buck as possible, and get remarried again. But unfortunately, they didn't have the opportunity. Based on all the evidence that they had, investigators really thought that they had a homicide case with them, except for they didn't have a body and they didn't have an eyewitness, which means that anything in court would be very hard to sell to a jury because they didn't have any evidence of an actual homicide, only that a man was missing. So Janice and Dina, who both were at the home when they first saw things kind of go wrong, decided that on Wednesday they were going to go out to Buck's house and see what they could find. So they drove out to Buck's house, which was in kind of a farmland area. He had multiple acres of land. And so they went out there and they noticed his car was in a tin shed. And so they went up to the car and opened it up. And they found this mysterious wet liquid on the ground of the car in kind of like the middle section of the car between the seats, from what I could understand. But they could never figure out what exactly that liquid was. They also found blood on the rear bumper of the car, and that's when they realized they needed to get out of there and call the police. So they immediately called the police. Police came in and found everything that the women found, plus a couple more places that blood was found, including the brake shift handle and the steering wheel as well. When asked about the blood in the car, Buck just said, "Oh, I must have had a cut on my hand and touched the steering wheel and touched the handle to the brake." And when the police asked him which finger he cut himself on, Buck said, "Well, I must have not cut myself," because he had no cuts on his fingers. That night, Janice returned to the hospital to visit Shirley with her husband, who also happened to be named Gary. So I'm going to talk about a different Gary here for a second. So Gary and Janice go to the hospital to visit Shirley, and sure enough, Buck is there just sitting by her side and kind of like waiting there. And he seems nervous and a little bit quiet. And so they start talking about some of the things that they found at the house, and they're casually talking about how odd this is and some of the evidence that the police found already. So Janice asks Shirley about this missing pillow, and she said, "It's really strange that that pillow isn't where it normally is. Have you misplaced it?" And Shirley said, "No, it should be on the couch where it always is." And so there should be no reason that that pillow was missing. But while that conversation is happening, Buck turns to Gary Holland and asks him, "I heard that they found blood on the couch and on a pillow." And Gary returns with, "Well, they also found blood spatters on the wall near the kitchen." And that's when Buck goes completely silent and doesn't speak another word and leaves the hospital, not even tending to Shirley anymore. So I know a lot of you guys are going to start asking about DNA testing. And from what we know, DNA wasn't quite used on this case yet because it just wasn't very prevalent in case files back then. But they did take scrapes of blood from both of the scenes and they matched them to the people of interest in this case. And the blood type at the scene was type A. And we also know that Gary Sebek was type A blood type. And we know that Buck was a type O. So take that with what you will. And we'll move forward. On March 11th, a neighbor actually came forward and said that she heard gunshots the night that Gary went missing. And she says that she heard a couple gunshots. She waited about 5 or 10 minutes before checking outside, and she noticed that her neighbor's home, the Sebek home, had all the lights on. And so she went over to her husband and commented about the gunshots to him, but he said, "No, I bet it's just a car backfiring and it sounds like gunshots." But she swore to police that she heard gunshots that night. On March 13th, it's discovered that Ruth, Buck's wife, was known to have a mental illness, and she actually went to a mental health facility for some time back in 1965 because she was so affected by her husband being obsessed with their adopted daughter. Now, I'm not exactly sure how this all fits in with the case, but I do just want to note that yes, she had some mental health issues, but they also draw that conclusion from her husband being so obsessed with their adopted daughter. On April 24th, a typed note was given to Shirley at her home. It was from Hiawatha, Kansas, and it was written by somebody named Caroline. And sorry, I should have said typed by somebody named Caroline. And this letter pretty much said that they had fallen in love with Gary, and they decided together that they were going to run away from Gary's marriage and start a new life and start a new family because they didn't believe that Patrick was Gary's son. So they believed this solely based on Patrick's hair color being too dark to be Gary's son. Gary's parents and wife both said to the public, no, he would have never run away from his family. We were actually planning to run away down to Florida anyway, so this would have never happened. He would have never just gone away from us. And they dismissed that this was even true at all. So May brings a couple of different events, and the first one is on May 10th, where they get a search warrant to look at all of Buck's typewriters, and they firmly believe that this note that was written by a Caroline was actually written by Buck. And sure enough, they were correct. They found a typewriter in his possession that matched the typewriter that would have made this note. And again, he is the one that claimed that Patrick was his own son and not Gary's son. And that reflects kind of on the letter that Shirley got. On the 13th of May, Shirley actually voluntarily gives a polygraph test. Now, we've talked about it multiple times in my videos that polygraph tests, they can be beat. But there's a lot of people that believe in them fully. A lot of people will swear on a polygraph test or a lie detector test, but they aren't admissible in most courts. But she voluntarily gave 2 of them back to back, and she passed them both. And she essentially said that she believes that Gary is dead and was murdered, possibly by Buck. And she actually fears for her own life at that point too. She verbally tells police that she's afraid that she's going to die next. Now on January 16th, 1969, the FBI gets involved with Gary's case because he pretty much gets pulled in the draft and he doesn't show up. And so this now is becoming a more widely spread national matter that everybody's looking for Gary. In April of 1969, we now have found that there's been 40 police officers that have scoured 240 acres of Buck's land trying to find anything that leads them to Gary, but nothing is there. Thankfully, Shirley stays true to her promise to Gary, and she moves far away from Buck and moves to Arkansas, where she takes her children, and a few years later, she decides to get remarried. Now, there's a lot ramping up with Gary's case. Apparently, there's a lot of allegations saying that Buck had 2 accomplices with him the night that Gary was murdered. And one of the accomplices was Buck's relative, and the other one being the relative's best friend. The best friend was pointed out to be Gordon Gill Jr. Now, Gordon Gill Jr., a few years later, was so riddled with guilt that he apparently reached out to Kenneth, who is Gary's relative. He decides to ask Kenneth if he can have a conversation with him. So he goes to his workplace and confronts him. But Kenneth isn't on break, and so he tells Gordon, can you please wait, and we'll talk here in a little bit. Well, Gordon didn't want to wait and decided to actually go home, write a suicide letter, which detailed all the events of that evening, and take his own life. Now, this is where things get kind of messy, because on one of the forums of the conversation about this case, a woman by the name of Kim Gill commented saying that Gordon was her father. She says that there was no letter and that she had heard accounts that Gordon had gone to Kenneth's home and that Kenneth didn't want to speak to him. And she also said that there were multiple things that her father was dealing with that could have led to his suicide, including the damage of his marriage. Apparently, her parents were having a hard time in their marriage, and he was dealing with a lot of depression. And so she said that none of that part was true. And I just wanted to include that because this could be correct. You know, there could have been no note, and it could have been false about, you know, where he went or what happened with his suicide. But there's also known to be quite a few people who go on to open forums about cases and put in false information or put in things just to kind of stir up more conversation. And this was an open forum where you could type in any name. So I don't know if it was somebody acting to be Kim, because I couldn't find anybody on social media by the name of Kim Gill. And again, that's not saying a whole lot, but I just want to make sure everybody sees every side of the story. So this could be true or it could be false, but I'm just going to keep going with the articles that I found. According to the letter that Gordon left, Buck had taken the body after it was delivered and put it in his plane, and he had a pilot's license, and Buck and his friend flew it down the Mississippi River and discarded of it. And so there were multiple police officers that scoured that land too, and they couldn't find anything to lead them to a body. In 1974, a couple more events happened, and I just wanted to add this because it kind of shows everything that happened with this family. So a man by the name of Melvin Price was driving from his home in Lincoln, Nebraska, and had some road construction issues along the way, so he ended up having to drive through Hamburg, Iowa, and stayed at a local club where he met Janice Holland and Buck, who, just to remind you all again, Janice was not adopted by Buck. Buck only adopted Shirley and her younger brother, but Janice was also married, and it seemed like that Buck had some type of protection around Janice from what the reports said, because they spent the night talking to Melvin. And at one point, somebody says that they actually saw Melvin and Janice kissing. And then later in that night into the early next morning, Melvin left with a couple more people. But at 4:30 a.m. the following day, he is found dead by a trucker. Somebody who had witnessed the scene said that Melvin's head looked like it had been bashed in with a tire iron. But when police arrived and investigated, they ruled it a hit and run. And the case went cold, even though the body didn't show any other effects of a hit and run. Normally when there's a hit and run, there's multiple broken bones, there's other scratches and bruises, but apparently all there was this head injury, which was the cause of death for Melvin. And that is all I have on the case. There's a lot of people who have since passed away who were involved in this case, including Gary's parents. Shirley passed away when she was 62. I also know that Buck has passed away when he was in his 90s, so anything he knew, if he was involved or not involved, he took with him to the grave. I'm going to put up the police information now. In case you know anything, please come forward. I know it was a case in 1968, but it really bothers me because the same day that Gary went missing, Patrick was born and never got to know his father. And so yeah, just keep that in mind. Also, please be respectful in the comments section. If you like this type of content, please subscribe, follow, or like whatever platform you're on. We do this every week, and I just got back from a hiatus, so hopefully I won't do that again for a while. But we also do travel blogs about Iowa. We tell Iowan stories, and we have so much more to come, and I'm so excited about it. So we will see you for the next Cases of Our Neighbors.